So my project is going to be on the attack on natural family planning. I've had so many conversations with friends and family who understand that contraception is wrong, understand that the church teaches that. Maybe they don't agree with the church's teaching, but they know that's what the church teaches. However, they have misunderstandings about the church's teaching on natural family planning. So what I wanted to address in this project was why natural family planning is different from contraception. Now, there are a lot of different ways to talk about contraception and to talk about natural family planning to prove whether they're morally right or morally wrong. And I could go into beautiful theology and theology of the body and all of that stuff. But right now what I want to do is kind of boil down the issues to the very basic object, intention, and circumstances of the act. The two different acts of natural family planning and contraception. Now, a lot of times people will say that natural family planning is not okay because it's the same as contraception, or they think that you should let God have control of your life and you shouldn't be trying to control whether he wants to give you a baby now or later. Now, how can we distinguish between natural family planning and contraception? The main reason why there's this claim that natural family planning and contraception are the same is because the intention of both couples using either of these forms of birth spacing is the same, namely to avoid getting pregnant. So the NFP using couple is using NFP sometimes to achieve pregnancy, but a lot of times to avoid getting pregnant. And contracepting couples obviously are using contraception to avoid getting pregnant. So in order to prove that they are morally different acts and therefore disprove contraception as morally permissible and support natural family planning as morally permissible, there has to be something else different between these two ways of birth spacing. So, why should NFP not be considered contraceptive mentality? That's the issue at hand. Why is it not contraceptive to avoid pregnancy by using natural family planning or the rhythm method or any other name for birth spacing? Well, in my research, I found an article called The Contra-Life Argument and the Principle of Double Effect by Lawrence Masek. And he tries to use the principle of double effect to disprove contraception as morally permissible and support natural family planning. The principle of double effect, according to Masek, is that you can cause a bad effect and it be morally justified only if the agent's intention and other conditions are satisfied. So basically, the principle of double effect requires that there are two effects of your action. One is good, the other not so good, but you're really intending the good one, and the bad one just happens. So the whole action is okay because the good outweighs that bad effect that you aren't actually intending. So Masek asserts that the reason contraception is morally wrong is that people act against human life by intending that a human life or lives not begin. He defines contraception as intentionally impeding procreation. He says that couples who use contraception want to have sex without the procreative consequences, and they intend the non-existence of a child as a means to their end. So it makes you question, well, if he thinks that the reason contraception is wrong is because the intention is contra life, then wouldn't NFP be wrong for the same reasons? Now, there are other arguments to prove that contraception is different from NFP, like, for instance, that in a contraception, sexual intercourse can't be given freely, or that contraception is wrong because it frustrates the natural end of sex. Masek just says those are not enough. Those are not going to cut it. We have to rule out contraception using something else. And so he argues that that contra-life argument is necessary. But because he argues that the intention to avoid children is wrong, he has to differentiate between the intention of the natural family planning couple, which is to avoid children, and the intention of the contracepting couple, which is to avoid children. And the way that he does this is he distinguishes between two types of intentions. So he splits up intention into two different categories. You can either intend something in this way. For example, intending X by having a desire that X that they hope to fulfill. Or you can intend X by having X as the end of the means of their actions. So in the case of natural family, you're intending X by having a desire for X that they hope to fulfill. Whereas in contraception, you're intending X by having X as an end of means for their actions. So, Macek uses the analogy of a sick child. He says this child has an earache and is also constipated, and the doctor says you can either treat the earache first and wait to treat constipation, or treat constipation, or you can treat the constipation first and wait to cure the earache. Now, the the parents of the sick baby, they have to choose whether they have to let their child suffer with an earache or constipation, but they're not intending that their child suffer with whatever ailment they don't choose to cure first. That's the principle of double effect. That's the analogy he's trying to use to prove that NFP is okay. So he somehow tries to use this analogy to claim that people can use NFP without intending that a human life not begin. He comes to this conclusion through the following reasoning, and I'm going to read through his reasoning. I think it's a little thin, and I think it doesn't work. But what he says is, as the parents treat the baby's recovery from constipation, couples who use NFP treat the good of human life. As the parents promote their baby's recovery from another condition, couples who use NFP promote the goods of the sexual act other than procreation. And as the parents do not intend their baby's constipation as an end, a couple who uses NFP do not intend a human being's non-existence as an end. As the parents do not intend their baby's constipation as a means to their end, couples who use NFP do not intend a human being's non-existence as a means to whatever ends they do pursue, which is, he gives the examples of raising other children, or completing their education, or saving money to have more kids, or getting over an emotional trauma, all the reasons that a couple would choose to avoid getting pregnant. So basically his argument is that when couples chart fertility, their charting isn't intended to avoid getting pregnant, it's intended to provide knowledge of how to promote other goods. If you're as dismayed by that argument as I am, then we're on the same page. And that's why this next argument really helped me to understand the next step this argument needs to take in order to prove that natural family planning is okay. So this article is actually a response to Lawrence Macek's argument, and it's called The Principle of Double Effect and its Inapplicability to the Case of Natural Family Planning, and it's by Reverend Jonah Pollock. So he addresses this issue in his article, and he aims to disprove Macek's argument that NFP involves the permission of an evil, though justified act. So they're not truly intending to avoid pregnancy, even though avoiding pregnancy is an evil in the eyes of Macek. They're intending other things, other good actions, and that's just a side effect, the principle of double effect. Now, the church's teaching on the immorality of contraception, Pollock thinks, is better articulated and defended by arguments that focus on the meaning of sexual act and the virtue of chastity. Pollock believes that the principle of double effect cannot correctly distinguish between NFP and contraception because it locates the immorality of contraception in the intention to prevent new life, which, according to Humanae Vitae, for couples practicing either contraception or NFP, it's perfectly acceptable and even virtuous to avoid getting pregnant, because that's what the church would consider responsible parenting, to cultivate the virtue of prudence, and to understand where God is calling you in your life. So, contraception is morally wrong and NFP is morally permissible, not because of an immoral intention to avoid a new life, but because contraception involves an immoral way of carrying out that intention. So then Pollock goes into why the principle of double effect can't work to disprove contraception. He says there's not two effects of contraception. The contracepting couple, all they do is intend to avoid getting pregnant. That's the only effect. So there's not another effect to weigh with that one. So the principal double effect doesn't work. And he also says that Masik's trying to stretch a little bit the philosophy of why principle of double effect works for NFP, because basically what Masik says is the two effects are a human being's non-existence and the goods other than procreation. But Pollack states that neither of these effects are actually actions that you take when you're practicing NFP. So Pollack denies that the sick baby analogy is relevant to the case of NFP. He does say that it works well to be an analogy to explain the difference between intention and motives, but it doesn't do anything for the case of NFP. So, how do we talk about natural family planning? Well, I happened upon Professor Miller's article. And Dr. Kevin Miller, in his article, How to Talk About the Use and Abuse of Natural Family Planning, the Importance of Accuracy in Translation and in Depiction, he discusses this main question that really pertains to our discussion here, and it's why should NFP not be considered contraceptive mentality? And why should it never be considered contraceptive mentality, even if practiced in a selfish way? So what he says is what Pollack had started to claim is that it's not the intention that's wrong, it's the object of the act itself. In their moral object, there is a fundamental difference between contraception and NFP. So in order for a moral act to be judged, there has to be object, intention, and circumstances. And all three of those have to be good in order for the action as a whole to be good. If the intention of the NFP and the couple using contraception is the same, to avoid having a child, the intention isn't what's wrong, so it has to be the object that's wrong, right? That has to be the fundamental difference. So, to narrow down what object means, take the example of adultery. In adultery, is the object of the act the other person's spouse, or is it having sex with the other person's spouse? Is it the object to which the action is directed, or the object of the act? And according to JP2, the object is a freely chosen kind of behavior, the proximate end of a deliberate decision which determines the act of willing on the part of the acting person. So the object is the act of intercourse with another person's spouse in the example of adultery. Object refers to an act considered not insofar as it has the natural tendency to produce a range of effects, but rather insofar as it is able to bring about the further end that's intended by the agent. So the object of the object is the act if it is able to bring about the further end that's intended by the person. So a contraceptive couple chooses the object of their act that fulfills the end of avoiding pregnancy is to minimize the fertility of the marital intercourse in which they engage. So they choose some act before, during, or after that will have this consequence precisely insofar as it will minimize the fertility of engaging in intercourse. So the object of NFP is very different from that object. The object of NFP is they choose to avoid intercourse precisely because the fertile times are fertile. In other words, insofar as this avoidance of intercourse is likely to achieve the end of avoiding getting pregnant. Now, choosing to abstain from sexual intercourse is not a morally wrong act. The object of that act is not morally wrong, whereas the minimizing fertility of the marital intercourse, that is wrong. In an NFP using couple, I couldn't choose to make my fertility less or more depending on when I did not want to have sexual intercourse. Whereas in contraception, you can say, I will make myself infertile when I want, wherever I want. And that is why there's a fundamental difference in the moral object of each of these actions. And it is the only foolproof way, in my opinion, that you can differentiate natural family planning from contraception. There are many beautiful ways to further embellish this truth, and theological ways to explain it, beautiful ways about theology of the body. But it all boils down to the fact that the object of the contracepting couple is to minimize their fertility, and the object of the NFP couple is simply to avoid having intercourse in the most fertile times. Despite what motivates each couple to do this is irrelevant to whether the object of their action is morally good or not. They could have the same intentions to avoid pregnancy, and they could have the same motives because they just went bankrupt and they need to wait to have another kid. Or they could have a selfish reason. They wanted to go on vacation and a kid would be inconvenient. But it doesn't change the fact, the circumstances of the moral acts don't change the fact that the object between natural family planning and contraception is completely different. And that is why the church can teach that contraception is wrong and natural family is right.